Friday the 6th of May. This is the Climate Alarm Clock. This week's main story is Europe doing enough to accommodate climate refugees? Also coming up in this week's show, we continue our Birdwatch Ireland and Book of Leaves collaborations, and we have a special culture feature with Colm O'Regan. Hello and welcome to the Climate Alarm Clock, Ireland's weekly climate news podcast. I'm Darragh. Every week we bring a mixture of climate stories, explainers and interviews. If you like what we do, then please make sure to subscribe and review the podcast wherever you listen. We're changing things up slightly this week. Ciara Daly and Anna Pringle aren't here with me today for our usual news roundup. We'll be back to that next week, but today instead we're going to focus more in depth on one climate story. So this week on the Climate Alarm Clock podcast, I'm joined by Shamim Malekmian from the Dublin Inquirer to talk about a story that she published at the end of April around the area of climate change and climate refugees. So Shamim, thanks a million for joining us on the Climate Alarm Clock.
Thanks for having me.
Can you start off just explaining to our listeners what the term climate refugee means?
I suppose you could define climate refugees as people whose house and livelihood has been destroyed by the impact of climate change, what you can describe as the impact of climate change. And that can be extreme floodings that may have ruined somebody's land and somebody's house. That can be earthquakes, that can be tsunamis, all sorts of different things that you would associate and we would associate with the impact of climate change due to its extreme nature. So people who are fleeing these conditions because they don't have anywhere else to go, who are displaced by these conditions, would be described as climate change refugees in the academic literature, at least anyway, you know.
Okay, yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the academic literature because actually lots of countries, including Ireland, don't actually consider people displaced by climate change as refugees.
Yeah, that is correct because, and it's just, as you said, it's just not Ireland. Just a study came out from Sweden and Austria, and it's said that not one person has been granted refugee status in Sweden due to ecological reasons. And there was just one person granted subsidiary protection, and this person basically wasn't on climate grounds. So, and I'll get to the distinctions between refugee and subsidiary protection status with you later. But that one person who had been granted subsidiary protection was because after there was an earthquake, they've been moved to a camp, and there was a well-established risk of sexual assault in those camps.
Okay, so we're seeing that the criteria for people to be granted protection is really, really strict. And so your article actually looked at two cases brought to Ireland's International Protection Appeals Tribunal where the consequences of climate change were given as a reason for seeking asylum. So can you talk a bit about those cases and those outcomes and the specific Irish examples?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's better for me to kind of explain to you the differences between refugee status for your listeners and subsidiary protection. Refugee status would be like when you can prove that there is a risk of persecution in your country if you'd be returned back to your country of birth. And subsidiary protection is granted to people who can prove that there is a serious risk of harm awaiting them if they're deported back to another country. And the law actually says what it means to be at risk of serious harm. And that is basically that you would be imposed or you would be subjected to degrading treatment and punishment. And the law obviously doesn't have any kind of room to mention climate change, ecological, natural disasters. So when I searched the keyword climate change in the IPAT database, I realized there was 5 cases, but only 2 directly related, as you mentioned, to climate change. And one of them was a case of a man from Malawi, and this person was studying here as an international student, and as he was studying, there was a flood in his country that not only destroyed his home and everything, his entire village was wiped out basically because of this, and the person who was sponsoring his stay in Ireland was actually killed during the floods. So this person obviously seeks asylum and decides to stay here. But the case, unfortunately, was completely rejected, and the decision maker, the tribunal member, made some remarks about whether or not climate change was real, as he was assessing this case. And he said, basically, if I was to give you this based on what the law allows me at the moment, I would accept that climate change is real. Climate change is man-made and it's done intentionally. So, and he said that it would be unlawful for him to accept all these three, even if he would accept climate change is real. Then he kind of said it was such a stretch to say some people burning fossil fuels in a country thousands of miles away from Malawi was causing this, whereas obviously it's proven that it is the case, and wealthier countries obviously causing with the CO2 emissions are causing this. But the third part of it was that the tribunal member, found it hard to accept that even if climate change was real and man-made, it was done intentionally. He basically made this argument that it would be more case of a gross recklessness as opposed to intent. So he said, even if you would be returned back to Malawi and you would be at risk of degrading treatment and punishment, it would be as a result of gross recklessness, not somebody intentionally, a state or a state actor intentionally harming you. You know what I'm saying? So, and the other part of it was that I suppose the man was making the argument that the government of Malawi was not giving proper kind of accommodation to people who were the victims of floodings, and they were in a camp. But again, the tribunal member said that people or inmates were free to come and go out of these camps. So this is something that inadequacy of a state charity, he said, is not basically considered qualified for international protection, So this was the case of the man from Malawi.
Yeah, so I think that gives a really clear picture of the inadequacies of our current systems and the impacts that can then have on an individual case. Can you tell us about the second case then?
Yeah, the second case was a man from Bangladesh, and he had like a severe case of diabetes, and he had poor eyesight as well. He had a mother in Bangladesh who was in the same boat, basically grappling with diabetes and poor eyesight. And the problem was that he was facing that their land was destroyed. So they used to grow crops, but at that moment they couldn't do it. So they were very, very poor. And basically what was happening was that the insulin that the mom had to buy was not free for everybody. So because of the corruption or whatever issues that he's in Bangladesh. So he was working here in Ireland and was sending back money to his mother who was buying this medication. So he was kind of saying that if I go back to Bangladesh, well, my mother would go without medication. But again, even though it was accepted that their livelihood was destroyed as a result of climate change, it was not accepted that if he would go back, they would be at a serious risk of harm, So, and that tribunal member made a comment about if they can't access free insulin, I suppose it's a result of corruption, and corruption is a naturally occurring phenomenon, I suppose.
I think what you were saying there, particularly in the first case, you mentioned that chain of causality, and this idea of climate justice is something that I think more and more people are being aware of, that the people who cause climate change the most feel the impacts the least, and those who have done the least to cause this are feeling the most severe impacts. But actually this idea of climate justice, we're not actually seeing that reflected in the law or in our systems here at all, because these people, and these are just two examples in Ireland, that are being affected by climate change don't have access to justice, don't have access to asylum in this case. So what do you think needs to change? How can we get better at this? What needs to change from a legal or a policy or even a practical perspective to ensure that our systems are actually delivering climate justice?
If I kind of give you a bit of context, most of laws around refugees and as international protection are designed around the Refugee Convention. So it's used as some sort of guidelines for domestic laws, for refugee laws. So what happens here is that obviously this was drawn up in 1951, and where the climate change wasn't really an issue. I don't think it was even called climate change, and not it wasn't prioritized anyway, or understood. It was basically it was as a result of World War II. They had drawn this refugee convention up, and so obviously it doesn't include climate change. And the issue is that there is a concern, or one of my interviewees, one of my sources was saying that the concern is if the countries got together and decided to kind of amend the refugee convention to mention the impact of climate change, what would happen, they might never reach a consensus, because it's such a, I suppose, inflammatory topic, because a lot of people would be afraid that refugees would pour into their countries in the name of like being victims of climate change. So that's where an issue that's completely, I suppose, an ecological issue, but becomes very politicized, and people are being dismissed purely because political matters, and that's the worry, that people are not getting the recognition, because immigration is a very politicized issue, and this is a intersection of politics and environmental issues.
Yeah. So what can be done, or what do you think should be done?
Mm. Well, it's good that you're asking me for solutions, because I always do that. Yeah, I think what should happen necessarily is some are of this view that within the current framework of the law, there is still room to include climate change refugees. For example, there is a clause there saying if you are a member of a particular social group, and sometimes the Refugee Convention gives you the power to kind of think beyond the box, outside the box, and say, I suppose if you're a victim of climate change, if you are living in a camp in not in terrible conditions, then yes, maybe the tribunal member has this power to count you as a member of a particular social group that makes you distinct from the rest of the society, and can actually grant you subsidiary protection. So I think there can be room, in the current legislation, the current framework of the Refugee Convention, to cut people some slack, and to kind of accept the if they accept and establish the facts of their cases, to give them their status. But unfortunately, in one of the cases that I looked at, the man was just completely called an economic migrant or refugee by International Protection Office.
So would you say then that it's clear that there's kind of things in practice in the current system that can be done? So do you think it's a question of maybe more awareness and more knowledge, maybe for the decision makers and maybe the wider public on these issues?
Yeah, because I asked the Justice Department, I asked them, do you give a special training, for example, to your tribunal panel members, legal panel members at IPO or IPAT, or do they have separate guidelines on how to deal with climate refugees? And they just didn't respond to the query. And I have a source who used to work for the International Protection Office, and he said he'd never come across them, and he said he never got any training or he hadn't any guidelines, and he said to me that he wouldn't even touch it if a case came, because he said it would have been so difficult to, even if a decision maker wanted to give the status, it would have been so difficult to get the International Protection Officer to accept it, because they go through different routes. So and there are a lot of people who told me that they believe that if they said something like that to an IPO officer or IPAD officer, they would basically laugh at them, if they said they're climate change refugees.
Shamim, thanks so much for sharing your knowledge and insight on this topic with us on the Climate Alarm Clock. Do you have any final remarks before we wrap up?
I just like to know. I just like to note that even in 2020 alone, there was over 30 million people displaced as a result of climate change. And I think these numbers should be more than numbers, and we should kind of pay attention to them, you know.
Shamim, thanks so much for sharing your knowledge and insight on this topic with us on the Climate Alarm Clock. Do you have any final remarks before we wrap up?